For the overwhelming majority of human existence, life unfolded within repetition. The sun rose, the seasons turned, and the land, though often harsh, behaved in ways that could be learned, anticipated, and trusted. This repetition did not merely structure daily routines, it shaped the architecture of the human mind itself. Long before writing, long before agriculture, long before cities or monuments, early humans lived within environments that followed recognizable cycles. Rivers flooded, but they returned to their banks. Winters arrived, but they ended. Animals migrated away, and then, predictably, they came back. Danger was ever present, yet bounded. Predators hunted, but they could be avoided. Storms destroyed shelters, but they passed. Scarcity arrived, but it did not last forever. Across tens of thousands of years, these rhythms formed a psychological baseline, the expectation that disruption, however painful, would eventually resolve. Not because the world was gentle, but because it had always been survivable. From this lived experience emerged a silent but powerful assumption: continuity. This assumption was never articulated. It required no language. It existed beneath conscious thought, embedded in behavior rather than belief. It was absorbed simply by growing up in a world that repeatedly repaired itself. Children learned skills with an unspoken promise attached to every lesson. This knowledge will remain useful. A stone tool shaped today would still function tomorrow. A hunting strategy learned from elders would still apply next season. Knowledge mattered because the environment remained familiar enough for knowledge to retain value. This sense of continuity made something remarkable possible: long-term thinking. Humans invested energy in teaching, ritual, and shared meaning because the future felt real. Stories were told not only to survive the present, but to anchor identity across time. Art, however simple, existed because there was safety enough to imagine beyond immediate necessity. Even the earliest forms of spirituality reflected this stability. Nature was not perceived as random chaos, it was patterned, cyclical, governed. Forces greater than humanity existed, but they behaved consistently. The sky moved in recognizable rhythms. The stars returned to known positions. Time itself appeared orderly. From this order emerged trust. Not trust in comfort, but trust in structure. This trust was reinforced generation after generation. Those who assumed tomorrow would resemble today conserved cognitive energy. They avoided constant vigilance. They cooperated more easily. They formed larger social bonds because the future felt dependable enough to plan around. From an evolutionary perspective, this expectation was efficient. Anxiety is costly. A mind perpetually braced for annihilation wastes energy it cannot afford to lose. Stability, or the perception of it, allowed humanity to flourish psychologically, even when material conditions were difficult. The past, in this way, trained the mind. It taught humans what kind of world they inhabited, and for tens of thousands of years the lesson was consistent. The world changes slowly. This lesson was not naive. It was empirically grounded in lived experience. Catastrophes occurred, but they were localized. They did not overturn the fundamental structure of existence. The world bent, but it did not break. So the human mind learned to normalize continuity. What repeated became expected. What was expected became invisible. Permanence, though never guaranteed, began to feel natural. This is not ignorance. It is adaptation. To survive long enough to become a cultural species, humanity had to believe that tomorrow was worth planning for. That belief became embedded so deeply that it ceased to be examined. It became the background condition of consciousness. The danger of such a background belief is not that it exists, but that it goes unquestioned. When the environment behaves consistently for long enough, the mind begins to treat consistency as law rather than coincidence. Patterns harden into assumptions. Assumptions harden into certainty. The river will always return to its banks. The winter will always end. The sky will remain what it has always been. This was not a philosophical conclusion. It was a psychological inheritance. And like all inheritances, it shaped decisions without announcing itself. When the world is assumed to be stable, warnings are muted, anomalies are dismissed, signals that contradict expectation are treated as errors, not messages. The human mind excels at explaining away disruption, especially when disruption has never before rewritten the rules entirely. This is how the illusion of permanence takes hold, not through arrogance, not through denial, but through memory doing what it evolved to do, projecting the past forward. For most of human history, this projection worked, until suddenly, it did not. The human mind is not designed to imagine sudden endings. It is designed to extend patterns. When an experience repeats often enough, the brain treats it not as coincidence, but as structure. This is not a philosophical error. It is a cognitive shortcut, one refined by survival. To constantly expect catastrophe in a world that has remained largely consistent would have been inefficient, even harmful. And so the mind learned to filter reality. It learned to smooth irregularities, to downplay anomalies, to treat rare disruptions as exceptions rather than warnings. Psychologists describe this tendency as normalcy bias, the inclination to believe that the future will resemble the recent past, even in the presence of emerging threats. But in deep prehistory, this bias was not a weakness. It was an advantage. It conserved attention. It reduced fear. It allowed cooperation to flourish in environments where constant vigilance would have fractured social bonds. A group that believed the world was fundamentally stable could plan, teach, and build trust. A group that expected imminent collapse could not. Over time, this bias became invisible. It was no longer a strategy. It was simply how reality felt. The mind stopped asking whether stability would continue and began assuming that it would. This assumption did not require evidence. It was supported by memory itself. Thousands of ordinary days outweighed the rare abnormal one. The past, repeatedly confirming continuity, trained the brain to treat continuity as default. This is where the cognitive trap formed. Because when stability becomes default, instability becomes unthinkable. Early humans did not lack imagination. They imagined spirits, animals that spoke, worlds beyond death, but they did not imagine the permanent loss of the world they knew. They imagined danger within the world, not the disappearance of the world itself. Their stories warned of monsters, storms, and punishment, but rarely of absolute rupture. The idea that the sky itself might become hostile, that seasons might cease to function as expected, that entire ways of living could vanish within a single lifetime. These possibilities sat outside the boundaries of lived experience. And what lies outside experience is difficult for the mind to prepare for. This is the paradox of stability. The longer a system endures, the less imaginable its failure becomes. Cultural memory reinforced this illusion. Knowledge was transmitted orally, shaped by repetition and usefulness. Information that remained relevant survived. Information that did not faded. Over generations, memory became selective. It favored lessons that applied to a stable environment. It preserved techniques, rituals, and narratives that assumed continuity. There was no incentive to preserve knowledge of rare, unprecedented collapse. Such knowledge would have seemed abstract, even irrational. And so culture, like cognition, optimized for repetition. The environment taught humans what to remember, and stability taught them what to forget. As generations passed without systemic disruption, the belief in permanence hardened, not as dogma, but as expectation. The mind stopped asking, "Will this continue?" and began asking only, "How do we live within it?" This subtle shift matters. It marks the moment when adaptability gives way to assumption. When warning signs appear in such a cognitive environment, they struggle to gain meaning. An unusual winter is treated as misfortune, not signal. A strange sky is interpreted symbolically, not practically. Deviations are absorbed into existing frameworks rather than allowed to challenge them. The mind protects itself by explaining away what it cannot yet integrate. This is not denial, it is coherence maintenance. The brain resists interpretations that threaten its internal model of the world because collapsing that model would require rebuilding identity, behavior, and expectation from nothing. And that process is psychologically expensive. The illusion of permanence, then, is not arrogance. It is inertia. It is the weight of accumulated memory pressing forward, insisting that what has always worked will continue to work. It is the quiet confidence that tomorrow will arrive in recognizable form. And in most contexts, this confidence is rewarded. It reduces stress, it encourages cooperation, it allows societies to grow. But when change exceeds the speed of adaptation, this same confidence becomes a liability. When the environment shifts faster than memory can update, the mind does not respond with clarity. It responds with confusion. Signals are misread, threats are miscategorized, responses lag behind reality. The world begins to feel unreliable, not because it is chaotic, but because it no longer aligns with expectation. This is the moment when trust fractures. Not trust between people, but trust in reality itself. When the sky behaves in unfamiliar ways, when seasons lose their rhythm, when survival strategies passed down through generations suddenly fail, the illusion of permanence collapses. And because that illusion was never consciously examined, its collapse feels total. There is no gradual adjustment, there is only shock. The mind, faced with a reality it cannot reconcile with memory, enters a state of psychological emergency. It narrows focus. It abandons abstraction. It retreats into immediate survival. Long-term thinking evaporates. Cultural complexity becomes impossible to sustain. This is not because humans forget how to think. It is because thinking beyond the present moment becomes dangerous when the future itself feels hostile. The cognitive trap of stability does not merely delay response to catastrophe. It amplifies trauma when catastrophe arrives. The greater the trust in continuity, the deeper the rupture when continuity fails. What breaks is not just infrastructure or ecology, but confidence in the very idea of a stable world. And when that confidence shatters, something profound occurs. Humanity does not simply adapt to new conditions. It redefines what is worth remembering. Knowledge tied to the old world loses relevance. Stories anchored in former stability lose power. Memory itself becomes suspect. The past no longer offers guidance. It becomes a source of pain. This is where forgetting begins, not as accident, but as necessity. The illusion of permanence, once broken, leaves behind a vacuum. And into that vacuum rush fear, simplification, and silence. The mind does not rush to document what was lost. It rushes to endure what remains. What follows is not immediate amnesia, but gradual erasure. The details fade first. The context dissolves next. Over generations, only fragments remain, stripped of their original meaning. What survives is not history, but echo. The cognitive trap has closed, and humanity, having trusted the world too deeply to imagine its betrayal, enters a new psychological landscape, one shaped not by expectation, but by loss. For early humanity, the sky was not an abstract concept. It was not an empty expanse governed by impersonal laws. The sky was authority. It regulated time, delivered life, and imposed limits. Long before political structures or formal hierarchies existed, the sky occupied the highest position in the human order of meaning. It was watched, interpreted, feared, and respected, not because it was understood, but because it was consistent. Day followed night. Seasons followed one another. Celestial movements provided rhythm to existence itself. The sky did not merely sit above the world, it structured it. This relationship shaped how early humans understood causality. When rain arrived, the land fed them. When drought persisted, hunger followed. When the sun returned after winter, survival resumed. These patterns created a framework in which the sky became synonymous with reliability. It was distant, powerful, and beyond control, yet it behaved according to expectations that held across generations. In psychological terms, the sky became a stable external regulator, a force that could be trusted even if it could not be negotiated with. From this trust emerged reverence. The sky was not worshipped because it was mysterious, but because it was dependable. Its predictability made it worthy of respect. Over time, this respect crystallized into belief systems. The heavens became personified, moralized, endowed with intention. But beneath myth and ritual lay something simpler and more fundamental: the assumption that the sky would continue to behave as it always had. This assumption anchored early cosmology. The sky was not just a source of weather, it was a reference point for meaning. It provided orientation in time and space. It told people when to move, when to hunt, when to rest. It validated patterns of life. When rituals were performed under familiar stars, they felt sanctioned by something larger than the human group. The sky confirmed order. Psychologically, this matters because human beings seek external anchors. In uncertain environments, stability is often projected onto forces perceived as larger and more enduring than the self. For early societies, the sky filled that role. It was the ultimate constant, present across generations, unchanged by individual failure or success. Trust in the sky was, in effect, trust in the continuity of existence. This trust shaped emotional development. Fear existed, but it was contextual. A storm could be feared, but it was temporary. Darkness could be feared, but dawn was expected. Even danger carried an implicit endpoint. The sky framed suffering as episodic rather than terminal. And because suffering was perceived as bounded, endurance made sense. Over time, this dynamic produced a form of psychological security. Not comfort, but confidence. The belief that however difficult conditions became, the larger structure of the world would remain intact. The sky would not turn against humanity entirely. It might punish, but it would not annihilate. This belief was not naive optimism. It was reinforced by experience. The sky had always returned to balance. This is why changes in the sky carried such weight. Unfamiliar celestial events were not merely curiosities. They were disruptions of authority. When the sky behaved unexpectedly, when light dimmed, when temperatures fell beyond known patterns, when seasons failed to align with memory, the disturbance was not interpreted as random. It was interpreted as meaningful. For a society whose cosmology was grounded in stability, unpredictability signaled intent. A sky that no longer followed its own rules could not be neutral. It had become hostile, or at least indifferent. And indifference from an authority once trusted is profoundly destabilizing. This is where betrayal enters the human story. Betrayal is not simply harm. It is harm that violates expectation. It requires prior trust. The deeper the trust, the more disorienting the rupture. When early humans experienced prolonged environmental disruption that could not be reconciled with memory, the psychological impact extended far beyond survival. It struck at the foundation of meaning. The sky had taught humanity how the world worked. Now it appeared to contradict its own lessons. From a psychological perspective, this moment represents a collapse of external regulation. When the primary stabilizing force in a worldview becomes unreliable, Internal regulation falters as well. Anxiety rises. Interpretation fragments. The mind searches desperately for explanation, not because explanation restores control, but because meaning itself is at risk. Early humans did not possess scientific models to reinterpret these changes as impersonal processes. They possessed narrative frameworks, and those frameworks were relational. Forces acted with purpose. Events carried moral weight. The sky did not simply change, it communicated. But what it communicated was unclear. Punishment? Abandonment? Transformation? No answer fit the scale of disruption, and so belief systems strained under the pressure. Rituals no longer produced predictable outcomes. Offerings failed to restore balance. Patterns that once guided survival lost reliability. The authority that had structured existence now appeared unstable. This is not the birth of superstition. It is the crisis of trust. When an external authority fails, the psychological response is not immediate rejection. It is confusion, bargaining, reinterpretation. Humans attempt to preserve the relationship by adjusting meaning. They search for reasons that allow the authority to remain intact. Perhaps the rules were broken. Perhaps the rituals were insufficient. Perhaps the blame lay elsewhere. But when disruption persists, these strategies fail. The sky, once the ultimate reference point, becomes a source of uncertainty. And uncertainty, when prolonged, erodes psychological resilience. It forces the mind inward. It replaces confidence with vigilance. It transforms reverence into fear. This shift marks a profound change in human psychology. The world is no longer experienced as governed, but as volatile. Stability is no longer assumed. The future becomes opaque. Planning loses value. Memory loses authority because what worked before no longer guarantees survival. The betrayal of the sky is not a single event. It is a prolonged experience of unpredictability that undermines the very idea of cosmic order. And once that idea fractures, humanity enters a new psychological state, one in which trust must be rebuilt, not assumed. What follows is not immediate despair, but reinterpretation. The sky does not disappear from human thought. It transforms. It becomes something to fear, to appease, to mythologize. The language of certainty gives way to the language of caution, and in that transformation, the seeds of forgetting are planted. When an authority collapses, the damage is not limited to the moment of failure. It spreads inward. For early humanity, the sky had functioned as a stabilizing presence, precisely because it appeared indifferent to individual fate, yet reliable at the scale of generations. It did not reward virtue in any obvious way, but it provided structure. When that structure faltered, the psychological impact was not a single shock, but a prolonged unraveling. At first, the mind resists the conclusion that its most trusted reference point has failed. Humans are deeply motivated to preserve coherence. When reality contradicts expectation, the initial response is reinterpretation, not rejection. Early societies would have searched for explanations that allowed the sky to remain meaningful. Perhaps rules had been violated, perhaps rituals had been neglected, perhaps certain groups were at fault. These explanations were not irrational. They were attempts to restore order without dismantling the worldview that had sustained life for countless generations. But prolonged disruption undermines even flexible belief systems. When seasons fail repeatedly, when familiar patterns do not return, reinterpretation becomes strained. The psychological burden increases with each unfulfilled expectation. Rituals that once aligned human action with cosmic rhythm lose credibility. Authority erodes not because it is disproven, but because it no longer delivers stability. This erosion produces a distinct form of anxiety. It is not fear of a specific threat, but fear of unpredictability itself. The sky becomes something to monitor obsessively rather than trust implicitly. Attention shifts upward, not in reverence, but in vigilance. Humans begin scanning for signs, omens, warnings, anything that might restore a sense of anticipatory control. Psychologically, this marks a transition from confidence to hypervigilance. A stable world allows relaxed attention. An unstable world demands constant monitoring. Over time, this vigilance exhausts cognitive resources. The mind narrows its focus. Long-term narratives give way to immediate interpretation. Meaning fragments into symbols, each charged with disproportionate significance because the larger framework has failed. In this environment, belief systems do not disappear. They mutate. The sky does not cease to be meaningful. It becomes dangerous. Authority is not rejected. It is feared. The relationship between humanity and the heavens shifts from alignment to appeasement. This is not a return to ignorance. It is a survival strategy in a world that no longer behaves as expected. Fear alters memory. Experiences encoded under threat are remembered differently. They are compressed, emotional, and often symbolic. Details fade, but impressions persist. Over generations, these impressions harden into narrative motifs: angry skies, judging forces, cycles of punishment and renewal. What was once environmental instability becomes moralized. The mind seeks agency where predictability has vanished. This moralization serves a psychological purpose. It restores causality. If disruption can be explained as punishment or judgment, then behavior can be adjusted. Suffering becomes meaningful rather than random. Even a hostile authority is preferable to none at all. A world that punishes can still be navigated. A world without structure cannot. But this restoration is incomplete. The underlying trust does not return. Beneath the new narratives lies an unresolved wound, the realization that the sky can change in ways that memory cannot predict. This realization reshapes how humans relate not only to the heavens, but to time itself. The future becomes conditional. Planning extends only as far as uncertainty allows. Cultural investment shrinks. This shift has profound social consequences. When the future feels unreliable, societies prioritize survival over preservation. Knowledge that does not directly support endurance loses value. Skills tied to former stability become obsolete. Elders, once repositories of wisdom, find their knowledge increasingly irrelevant. Intergenerational continuity weakens. Memory, once a guide, becomes a reminder of loss. Here, forgetting begins to accelerate, not because humans choose ignorance, but because memory anchored to a vanished order becomes painful. Recalling how the world used to behave highlights how it no longer does. Forgetting becomes protective. It allows adaptation without constant comparison to a past that cannot be recovered. The collapse of divine order is therefore not a single theological event. It is a psychological reorientation. The sky no longer guarantees continuity. It no longer anchors meaning across generations. Instead, it becomes a source of threat, encoded in fear rather than trust. This transformation leaves a lasting imprint. Even as conditions eventually stabilize, the psychological shift endures. The memory of betrayal outlives the disruption itself. Cultural narratives retain themes of judgment, cycles of destruction, and the fragility of order. These themes persist not because they describe ongoing reality, but because they encode a learned caution. Humanity emerges from this period altered, less confident in permanence, more sensitive to signs of collapse, more willing to simplify, to compress, to retreat. The sky may eventually return to predictability, but the relationship has changed. Trust, once broken at a cosmic scale, does not fully regenerate. And in that broken trust lies the beginning of a deeper forgetting. not of events alone, but of former assumptions. The world that always returned is gone, not necessarily in fact, but in belief. What replaces it is a guarded consciousness, shaped by the memory of unpredictability. This is the psychological ground upon which the next transformation occurs. As fear becomes internalized and vigilance becomes habitual, the human mind adapts once more. It narrows further. It abandons complexity. It enters a state where survival overrides curiosity and immediacy eclipses memory. The betrayal of the sky does not end humanity's story. It redirects it, and in doing so, it prepares the conditions for a deeper freeze, not of the world, but of the mind itself. Extreme cold does not only reshape landscapes, it reshapes priorities. For early humanity, environmental collapse was not experienced as a sequence of data points or gradual trends. It was experienced as constraint. Space narrowed, options vanished, life compressed into a smaller and smaller set of acceptable actions. Under such conditions, the human mind undergoes a predictable transformation. It does not expand to meet complexity. It contracts to preserve life. When survival becomes uncertain, cognition changes its center of gravity. The brain reallocates attention away from abstraction and toward immediacy. Long-term planning gives way to short-term calculation. Curiosity, exploration, and symbolic thinking do not disappear entirely, but they lose urgency. What matters is warmth, calories, shelter, and movement. Everything else becomes secondary. This shift is not a failure of intelligence. It is intelligence applied under constraint. Neuroscience and psychology both suggest that chronic stress narrows cognitive bandwidth. Under prolonged threat, the mind prioritizes pattern recognition relevant to danger and resource acquisition. Imagination becomes risky. Creativity consumes energy without guaranteeing return. Even memory is reorganized. Instead of preserving broad narratives, the brain encodes actionable lessons: where to find food, how to avoid exposure, whom to trust. This narrowing of consciousness is adaptive in the short term. It allows individuals and groups to survive environments that would otherwise overwhelm them. But it comes at a cost. As the horizon of attention contracts, so does culture. Activities that depend on surplus, art, experimentation, ritual elaboration, knowledge accumulation, begin to erode. This is the winter of the mind. Not a metaphorical winter, but a cognitive one, a period in which mental life is governed by scarcity. When resources are abundant, the mind can afford to wander. When resources vanish, wandering becomes dangerous. Thought itself is disciplined by necessity. For early humans facing prolonged cold, this discipline would have been relentless. Keeping warm is not a single task. It is a continuous demand. Exposure kills silently and quickly. Hunger weakens judgment. Fatigue compounds error. In such conditions, the brain remains locked in a state of vigilance. Rest becomes shallow. Attention fragments. The mental space required for complex social coordination diminishes. Over time, this state becomes normalized. What begins as emergency response turns into baseline functioning. The mind adapts to a narrower world. This adaptation reshapes values. What is admired changes. Ingenuity is measured not by creativity but by efficiency. Skill is judged by immediate usefulness. Elders who once held authority through accumulated knowledge may find their relevance questioned if that knowledge no longer maps onto present conditions. Social hierarchies flatten or fragment as survival overrides tradition. Importantly, this process does not erase intelligence. It redirects it. Humans remain capable, but their capabilities are applied differently. Instead of building lasting structures, they build temporary solutions. Instead of preserving stories, they prioritize instructions. Language itself may simplify, favoring clarity over nuance. This simplification is not deliberate. It emerges organically from constraint. As cognitive focus narrows, so does temporal awareness. The future becomes shorter. Planning horizons shrink from generations to seasons, from seasons to days. The past, once a source of guidance, loses authority when its lessons no longer apply. Memory becomes unreliable not because it is false, but because it refers to a world that no longer exists. This creates a subtle psychological tension. The mind carries recollections of a different reality, one with more stability, more predictability, more space for meaning. But those recollections no longer help. In fact, they may hinder adaptation by encouraging strategies that fail under new conditions. Gradually, the mind learns to suppress them. Forgetting begins here, not as erasure, but as deprioritization. The brain does not delete memories, it simply stops retrieving them. What cannot aid survival becomes background noise. What causes grief becomes dangerous. In a world defined by scarcity, emotional weight is a liability. This process has generational consequences. Children born into such conditions never experience the earlier stability. Their baseline is different. What their elders remember as loss, they experience as normality. Cultural transmission falters, not because elders refuse to teach, but because what they teach no longer fits reality. Knowledge without application fades. Over time, this creates a rupture. Not a sudden break, but a gradual misalignment between memory and environment. Culture lags behind conditions, then fractures under the strain. What remains is a reduced cultural core, optimized for endurance rather than expression. The winter of the mind is therefore not an intellectual dark age in the conventional sense. It is a cognitive reorientation. Humanity does not become less capable. It becomes less expansive. The range of acceptable thought narrows. The tolerance for uncertainty decreases. The appetite for complexity diminishes. And once this contraction sets in, reversing it is difficult. Even if environmental conditions later improve, the psychological habits formed under scarcity persist. Vigilance does not disappear overnight. Trust in abundance does not return easily. The mind, having learned to survive with less, remains cautious about expansion. This lingering caution shapes what is remembered and what is passed on. Stories that emphasize danger survive. Narratives of abundance fade. The past becomes filtered through the lens of hardship. What is transmitted is not a full account of what once existed, but a compressed version tailored to warn rather than inspire. Thus, the winter of the mind does not simply accompany environmental collapse. It outlasts it. It becomes a legacy passed down through behavior, values, and fear. Even when the world begins to recover, human consciousness remains partially frozen, reluctant to trust again. This is how a species survives catastrophe but loses continuity. Not because it forgets how to think, but because it learns that thinking broadly can be dangerous. The mind chooses safety over scope, survival over memory, endurance over meaning. And in doing so, it prepares the ground for the next stage of regression, one that will reshape societies, fragment communities, and further erode the thread that once connected humanity to its deeper past. When the human mind enters a prolonged state of scarcity, it does not merely prioritize survival. It restructures itself around it. Over time, behaviors that once supported creativity, experimentation, and symbolic expression begin to feel dangerous rather than beneficial. Curiosity, once a driver of adaptation, becomes a liability. Asking unnecessary questions wastes energy. Exploring unknown paths risks exposure. Innovation without immediate payoff becomes a gamble few can afford. In such conditions, the mind learns restraint. This restraint is not imposed by authority, it is enforced by consequence. Those who deviate from proven strategies are more likely to fail. Those who conserve effort and follow established routines endure. Gradually, behavior converges toward what works in the narrowest sense. Variation decreases. Flexibility narrows. The range of acceptable action contracts. Psychologically, this produces a subtle but powerful shift in motivation. Exploration is replaced by repetition. Novelty is viewed with suspicion. What is known, even if imperfect, is safer than what is untested. The brain rewards familiarity not because it is optimal, but because it reduces risk. This is how curiosity erodes without being forbidden. Over generations, this erosion accumulates. Cultural practices that once existed for meaning rather than survival lose relevance. Rituals simplify or disappear. Symbolic systems that require time and explanation fade in favor of direct instruction. Language itself may become more utilitarian, emphasizing clarity and immediacy over metaphor and depth. Importantly, this is not cultural collapse in the dramatic sense. It is cultural compression. Society does not vanish, it condenses. The effects of this compression are uneven. Some domains persist because they serve survival directly. Tool-making continues. Hunting strategies refine. Social bonds within small groups strengthen, but broader structures weaken. Intergroup coordination diminishes. Long-distance exchange becomes rare. Knowledge that once circulated widely becomes localized and fragile. As cognitive focus narrows, so does social imagination. The idea of large, interconnected communities becomes difficult to sustain mentally. Trust shrinks to the familiar. Outsiders become risks rather than opportunities. Cooperation contracts to kinship and proximity. This psychological narrowing has a profound impact on memory. Memory is not a passive archive. It is an active system shaped by relevance. Under scarcity, memories that do not contribute to survival are accessed less frequently. Over time, they weaken. Details blur. Context dissolves. What remains are fragments, stripped of their original complexity. This process does not require trauma to erase memory. It requires neglect. When stories are no longer told because they do not help, they fade. When skills are no longer practiced because they are no longer useful, they are lost. When explanations no longer fit reality, they are abandoned. The mind trims itself continuously, guided by necessity. Children born into this environment inherit a reduced cognitive landscape. They are not aware of what has been lost. Their baseline is narrower. What elders recall as decline, they experience as normality. This generational asymmetry accelerates forgetting. Each generation passes on less than it received, not by choice, but by relevance. Over time, even the awareness of loss disappears. This is the most profound consequence of the winter of the mind. Not that humanity suffers, but that it adapts so thoroughly that it no longer remembers adapting. What began as emergency becomes tradition. What began as constraint becomes identity. Psychologically, this creates resilience at the cost of continuity. The mind becomes efficient, focused, and durable, but it also becomes less reflective. The capacity to imagine alternative futures diminishes. The ability to remember alternative pasts weakens. Curiosity does not vanish entirely. It retreats. It survives in muted forms, expressed cautiously, bounded by utility. Questions are asked, but only those that promise immediate answers. Wonder becomes private, not communal. Exploration becomes rare, not celebrated. This retreat of curiosity has lasting implications. Even when environmental conditions later improve, the habits formed under scarcity persist. The mind does not automatically expand when danger recedes. Vigilance lingers. Risk aversion remains. The cognitive muscles of exploration and abstraction, long unused, weaken. Recovery, when it comes, is therefore uneven. Material conditions may improve faster than psychological ones. The world may become safer before the mind trusts it to be so. This lag shapes the trajectory of post-crisis societies. They rebuild cautiously. They favor redundancy over innovation. They preserve what works rather than experimenting with what might. In this context, the past becomes increasingly inaccessible. Not because it is hidden, but because it no longer aligns with lived reality. Memories of broader social structures, richer symbolic systems, and greater complexity feel alien. They lack anchoring in the present, and without anchoring, memory loses force. Forgetting, then, is not a sudden wipe. It is a slow dimming, a background process driven by adaptation. The winter of the mind teaches humanity how to survive with less, but it also teaches humanity how to let go. What is lost is not intelligence, but range. Not capability, but scope. The human mind remains powerful, but it operates within tighter boundaries. Those boundaries are reinforced by fear, habit, and the long echo of instability. As this state stabilizes, it sets the stage for a broader social transformation. Small groups replace large ones. Complexity gives way to simplicity. Culture regresses not because humans forget how to build, but because building broadly no longer feels safe. This is the threshold humanity crosses as it moves from psychological contraction to social regression. The mind has already narrowed. Society will follow. And in that transition, the thread connecting humanity to its deeper past grows thinner still, preparing the ground for a world that remembers only fragments of what it once was. Regression does not announce itself as collapse. It arrives quietly, disguised as adaptation. For early humanity, the transition from psychological contraction to social regression was not marked by a single moment of failure, but by countless small decisions made under pressure. As environments grew harsher and unpredictability persisted, the scale of human organization began to shrink. Not because people forgot how to cooperate, but because cooperation beyond a certain size became too costly. Complex societies depend on surplus. Surplus allows specialization. Specialization allows abstraction. When surplus disappears, these layers unravel in reverse order. The first casualties are not physical structures, but social ones. Roles that once existed to serve culture, memory, or coordination lose relevance. What remains are functions tied directly to survival. Under prolonged scarcity, large groups fragment. This fragmentation is not ideological, it is logistical. Feeding many mouths requires predictability. When predictability vanishes, smaller groups become more viable. They move faster, consume less, and adapt more easily to shifting conditions. What is lost in capacity is gained in resilience. This process alters social dynamics at every level. Authority becomes situational rather than institutional. Leadership is measured by immediate competence, not accumulated wisdom. Elders who once guided communities through memory and tradition may find their influence diminished if their knowledge no longer applies. Respect shifts from those who remember to those who can act. As group size decreases, social imagination contracts with it. Large-scale coordination, projects that require trust beyond immediate kin, becomes increasingly difficult. The mental burden of maintaining relationships across distance or difference grows heavier under stress. Suspicion rises. Familiarity becomes safety. Outsiders are no longer potential allies, but potential threats. This narrowing of social trust is not moral failure, it is risk management. Human beings evolved to cooperate, but cooperation carries cost. It requires time, communication, and shared expectation. In stable environments, these costs are offset by long-term benefits. In unstable ones, they become liabilities. The mind, already narrowed by scarcity, favors strategies that minimize exposure. Smaller groups satisfy this requirement. As societies contract, knowledge fragments, skills become localized. Techniques refined over generations may survive in one group and vanish in another. Without networks to transmit information broadly, innovation stagnates. Even when new solutions emerge, they struggle to spread. Each group becomes an island of experience, adapting independently, often redundantly. This isolation accelerates cultural divergence. Practices drift, languages shift, shared narratives fracture. What was once collective memory becomes private recollection. Over time, these recollections fade without reinforcement. Memory requires audience. Without scale, memory weakens. The material record reflects this regression. Tools simplify. Construction becomes temporary. Objects are designed for immediacy rather than longevity. This does not indicate intellectual decline, it indicates reprioritization. Permanence is meaningless when continuity is uncertain. What matters is function, not legacy. Psychologically, this shift reinforces the patterns established during the winter of the mind. Short-term thinking becomes default. The future shrinks further. Planning horizons rarely extend beyond immediate needs. The idea of building for distant descendants loses relevance. Children are raised to endure, not to inherit. This is the great regression, not a fall from sophistication into ignorance, but a retreat from scale into manageability. Importantly, regression is not uniform. Some regions stabilize earlier. Some environments remain more forgiving. In these pockets, larger groups may persist longer, but without broader networks, their knowledge remains vulnerable. A single disruption, a drought, a flood, a migration, can erase generations of accumulated skill. This fragility is key. Regression does not merely reduce complexity, it increases the likelihood of loss. When knowledge is concentrated in fewer people and fewer places, its survival becomes precarious. The death of a single individual can mean the disappearance of an entire technique. The loss of a single group can erase a lineage of understanding. Over time, humanity becomes smaller in every sense that matters socially. Not fewer in number, but narrower in connection. The species survives, but it survives fragmented. This fragmentation shapes identity. People begin to define themselves less by shared history and more by immediate belonging. Lineage replaces legacy. The past is remembered not as a collective journey, but as a series of isolated struggles. What lies beyond living memory feels abstract, even irrelevant. This psychological environment discourages preservation. Why maintain records of a world that no longer exists? Why teach children about structures they will never encounter? Memory becomes selective, favoring lessons that apply now. As this selectivity compounds across generations, the deep past recedes. Not because it is intentionally erased, but because it ceases to serve a purpose. What cannot help survive the present is allowed to fade. The Great Regression, therefore, marks a turning point. Humanity does not lose its capacity for complexity, it loses the conditions that reward it. And without those conditions, complexity becomes a risk rather than an asset. This shift prepares the ground for the next stage of forgetting. As societies shrink and fragment, the mechanisms that once preserved culture weaken. Knowledge no longer accumulates, it cycles. Progress stalls, not because humans stop learning, but because learning no longer builds upon itself. What remains is endurance without continuity. And in that endurance, the memory of what humanity once was grows thinner still. As human groups became smaller, the meaning of society itself began to change. Society was no longer defined by shared culture, accumulated knowledge, or long-term coordination. It was defined by survival. The measure of success shifted from continuity to endurance. What mattered was not how much a group could preserve, but how efficiently it could persist through uncertainty. This shift altered the internal logic of human communities. Decisions once guided by tradition or collective memory were now guided by immediacy. Authority became fluid, tied to situational competence rather than inherited status. Leadership emerged around those who could secure food, navigate danger, or make rapid judgments under pressure. Memory-based authority weakened. Action-based authority rose. In this environment, social roles compressed. Specialists disappeared, not because specialization was forgotten, but because it was no longer sustainable. A group struggling to survive could not support individuals whose contributions were indirect or long-term. Everyone became multifunctional. Knowledge narrowed to what could be practiced daily. Skills that required long apprenticeship or abstract understanding were abandoned. This had cascading effects. Without specialization, innovation slowed. Without innovation, adaptation relied on repetition. Groups reused what worked rather than developing what might work better. Risk aversion became embedded not only psychologically but socially. Deviation from established practices was discouraged, not by rule, but by consequence. As survival replaced society as the organizing principle, cultural expression diminished. Music, art, and ritual did not vanish entirely, but they simplified. Their role shifted from meaning-making to regulation. Rituals became shorter, more practical, focused on cohesion rather than transcendence. Stories emphasized caution, obedience, and endurance. Themes of loss and danger dominated, while narratives of exploration and growth receded. This cultural contraction further weakened intergenerational continuity. Children were taught what to do, not why it was once done differently. Context was stripped away. Explanations became instructions. Over time, even the awareness that deeper meaning had once existed faded. Culture became functional memory. The fragmentation of society also altered how humans related to space. Long-distance movement became riskier. Travel required resources and trust that were increasingly scarce. As groups settled into narrower territories, their understanding of the wider world diminished. Geographic imagination shrank. What lay beyond familiar terrain became unknown, then irrelevant. This spatial contraction reinforced social isolation. Without regular contact, groups diverged rapidly. Shared languages fractured. Common symbols lost recognition. Even when groups encountered one another, communication was strained. Difference bred caution. Exchange became limited. Knowledge remained trapped within local boundaries. Over generations, this isolation transformed humanity's relationship with its own past. Without networks to sustain collective memory, history lost coherence. What survived were local stories, often stripped of chronology and context. Events blurred into archetypes, causes collapsed into symbols. The deep past became mythic, not because it was fantastical, but because it could no longer be reconstructed accurately. Importantly, this regression did not feel like loss to those living through it. It felt like necessity. Each generation adapted to the conditions it inherited. Children born into fragmented societies did not mourn complexity they had never known. Their sense of normal was calibrated to scarcity. What earlier generations remembered as regression, they experienced as stability. This generational reset is crucial. Forgetting accelerates when loss is no longer perceived as loss. When memory fades below awareness, it no longer resists erosion. What remains is a simplified worldview that feels complete because alternatives are unimaginable. Psychologically, this produces resilience coupled with limitation. Humans become adept at surviving within narrow margins. They learn to endure hardship with minimal resources, but their capacity to envision large-scale futures weakens. Ambition narrows. Curiosity remains constrained. The idea of rebuilding complex societies feels distant, even implausible. This is not because humans lose intelligence. It is because intelligence adapts to context. A mind shaped by survival prioritizes efficiency over expansion. It favors certainty over possibility. It learns to distrust scale. As this mindset stabilizes, it shapes the trajectory of recovery. Even when environmental conditions gradually improve, social structures do not immediately expand. The psychological habits formed under regression persist. Trust in surplus does not return quickly. Cooperation beyond kin remains risky. Complexity is approached cautiously. Rebuilding, when it begins, is incremental. New social forms emerge, but they are layered atop a reduced foundation. Much of what existed before regression is no longer accessible, not because it was destroyed physically, but because the cognitive and social frameworks required to sustain it have vanished. This is why later civilizations appear to arise suddenly in the archaeological record. What looks like abrupt emergence is often re-expansion from a compressed state. Humanity does not start from zero, but from fragments. Knowledge is rediscovered unevenly. Techniques are reinvented rather than inherited. Progress resumes, but continuity is broken. The Great Regression thus marks a deep rupture in human history. Not a collapse into ignorance, but a narrowing of possibility. Humanity survives, but at the cost of forgetting how much it once knew, how broadly it once organized, how confidently it once planned for the future. What remains after regression is not emptiness, but silence. A silence filled with half-remembered forms, unexplained monuments, and cultural echoes without clear origin. Later generations inherit this silence and attempt to interpret it using their own frameworks. And because the continuity has been lost, interpretation replaces memory. This is the condition into which humanity emerges as it slowly rebuilds. A species still capable of complexity, but separated from its deeper past by layers of adaptation, fear, and necessity. A species that remembers surviving, but not what it once survived as. The Great Regression does not end humanity's story. It sets the stage for misunderstanding it. Culture does not disappear all at once. It thins. It weakens at the edges before collapsing at the center. For early humanity, emerging from prolonged regression, the greatest loss was not material, but human. Culture, unlike tools or shelters, does not survive on its own. It lives inside people. And when those people vanish, culture follows. In stable societies, knowledge accumulates across generations. Skills are refined, stories deepen, meanings layer upon one another. Elders play a crucial role in this process. They are not simply older individuals, they are living archives. They carry techniques learned through repetition, context acquired through experience, and narratives shaped by long memory. Their value lies not in what they can do physically, but in what they remember. Under conditions of prolonged hardship, this structure collapses. Cold, hunger, and disease do not kill evenly. They target the vulnerable first. The elderly, already weakened by age, are often the first to succumb. With their deaths, entire libraries vanish without record. Skills that require years of transmission lose their final carriers. Stories that depend on lived context lose coherence. What remains are fragments passed down by those who never fully understood them. This is not sudden amnesia. It is generational rupture. When elders die prematurely, the chain of transmission breaks. Knowledge that cannot be learned quickly enough disappears. Techniques that require apprenticeship fail to cross the gap. Cultural continuity depends on overlap between generations. When that overlap narrows, memory collapses inward. The consequences are profound. Younger generations inherit a world filled with remnants they cannot fully explain. Structures remain, but the reasoning behind them is gone. Practices persist, but their original purpose is unclear. Rituals continue, but their meaning fades into habit. Culture becomes form without context. Psychologically, this produces disorientation. Humans rely on narrative to anchor identity. When the narrative fractures, identity becomes unstable. People know what they do, but not why it was once done differently. The past becomes opaque, not because it is distant, but because its interpreters are gone. This loss reshapes how knowledge is valued. When deep memory disappears, utility becomes the primary criterion for preservation. Skills that solve immediate problems survive. Skills that encode symbolic or long-term understanding do not. Culture sheds complexity under pressure, retaining only what can be used now. This is where the death of culture truly begins, not with destruction, but with selection. What survives is not the best of the past, but the most adaptable to the present. Over time, this selection biases culture toward simplicity. Nuance fades. Specialized knowledge disappears. Systems that once required coordination across time and space become impossible to maintain. Importantly, this process does not feel like loss to those living through it. Each generation adapts to what it receives. Children born after the rupture never experience the full culture. Their baseline is reduced. What earlier generations would have recognized as decline appears normal to them. Culture does not feel diminished. It feels complete within its new boundaries. This normalization accelerates forgetting. Loss unacknowledged cannot be resisted. When the memory of loss fades, so does the motivation to recover what was lost. Culture settles into a narrower equilibrium. The archaeological record reflects this transition. Periods following major disruption often show a decline in complexity, simpler tools, fewer artifacts, less variation. This has sometimes been interpreted as evidence of primitive development. In reality, it often reflects the aftershock of cultural collapse. Humanity is not moving forward from ignorance, but backward from interruption. This distinction matters. A society rebuilding from collapse does not resemble one developing for the first time. It carries fragments, partial techniques, incomplete designs, unexplained traditions. These fragments can persist for millennia, embedded in habit rather than understanding. Psychologically, fragments are difficult to integrate. Without context, they resist explanation. They become sources of confusion or reverence. People preserve them because they feel important, not because they know why. This is how mystery enters the human relationship with its own past. As culture thins, explanation gives way to assumption. Practices are followed because they have always been followed. Meaning becomes implicit, not articulated. Over time, even the memory that meaning once existed fades. Culture becomes ritualized behavior rather than shared understanding. This transformation alters how societies relate to knowledge itself. Learning shifts from exploration to imitation. Innovation slows. Curiosity is constrained by caution. When the past is unclear and the future uncertain, experimentation feels dangerous. It risks destabilizing the fragile equilibrium that allows survival. Thus, the death of culture is not dramatic. It is quiet. It unfolds across generations, hidden within adaptation. By the time it becomes visible, it has already reshaped identity. What remains is not a blank slate, but a reduced inheritance. Humanity carries forward pieces of its former self without knowing how they once fit together. The deeper logic of culture, its systems, its philosophies, its cumulative memory, is gone. And once culture loses its carriers, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Knowledge without teachers does not survive. Memory without storytellers fades. Meaning without context dissolves. This is the condition into which humanity eventually stabilizes. A world populated by survivors who inherit fragments rather than traditions. A species that endures, but does not fully remember how it once lived. The death of culture, then, is not an ending. It is a transformation. Culture does not vanish. It contracts into something smaller, more rigid, more cautious. What is lost is not the capacity for meaning, but the depth of it. And in that loss lies the reason why later civilizations would look back at the deep past and see silence rather than continuity. When culture loses its carriers, knowledge does not disappear violently. It fades through disuse. Skills that once required decades to master vanish within a single generation if they are no longer practiced. Techniques that depend on collective memory fracture when reduced to individual recollection. What survives is not the most advanced knowledge, but the knowledge most immediately applicable to survival. This process is subtle, and because it is subtle, it often goes unnoticed by those living through it. A community may continue to build shelters, but the architectural principles that once guided construction are simplified. Measurements become approximate. Symmetry loses importance. Materials are chosen for availability rather than durability. Over time, structures become more temporary, not because people prefer them so, but because permanence no longer feels attainable. The same occurs with tools. A finely crafted implement requires not only skill, but patience, stability, and expectation of reuse. Under uncertainty, these assumptions collapse. Tools become disposable. Precision yields to speed. Repair gives way to replacement. The logic of craftsmanship erodes, replaced by the logic of sufficiency. Knowledge tied to long-term cycles suffers most. Astronomy, seasonal prediction, landscape management, disciplines that depend on extended observation lose coherence when conditions shift unpredictably. When the sky no longer behaves as memory suggests, celestial knowledge loses authority. When seasons no longer align with expectation, agricultural foresight becomes unreliable. Knowledge that once guided survival becomes suspect. Psychologically, this breeds distrust in inherited wisdom. Elders may speak of patterns that no longer manifest. Younger generations, shaped by instability, learn to rely on direct experience rather than tradition. This shift accelerates forgetting. Memory becomes personal, not collective. What cannot be verified immediately is discounted. As this discounting spreads, abstraction suffers. Concepts that require explanation beyond immediate experience are abandoned. Language adapts accordingly. Words that once carried layered meaning lose nuance. Vocabulary shrinks around practical domains. Expression becomes direct, functional, stripped of metaphor. This linguistic contraction has lasting effects. Language shapes thought. When language simplifies, the range of expressible ideas narrows. Complex relationships become harder to articulate. Subtle distinctions fade. Over time, the cognitive tools required to reconstruct past complexity weaken. This does not mean humanity becomes incapable of complex thought. It means that complexity loses cultural reinforcement. Without shared frameworks to support abstraction, individual insights struggle to propagate. Knowledge remains isolated, fragile, easily lost. Importantly, this loss is not perceived as ignorance. It is experienced as clarity. A simpler world feels more manageable. Fewer concepts reduce confusion. Certainty increases when ambiguity is eliminated. In this way, regression can feel like improvement. But clarity achieved through reduction comes at a cost. It limits the ability to interpret remnants of the past. When later generations encounter structures, artifacts, or traditions whose purpose is unclear, they lack the conceptual scaffolding to understand them. Explanation gives way to speculation or reverence. This is how mystery replaces memory. Fragments of former culture persist as anomalies, monuments without builders, techniques without origins, stories without context. These fragments are preserved because they feel significant, but their significance cannot be articulated. Over time, they are incorporated into myth, ritual, or symbolism. Their original function disappears. This transformation is often mistaken for deliberate myth-making. In reality, it is a coping response to cognitive loss. When explanation fails, meaning is reassigned. The mind prefers symbolic coherence to uncertainty. It would rather believe a structure was sacred than admit it does not know why it exists. As knowledge thins, authority shifts again. Those who can provide interpretation, however speculative, gain influence. Explanation, even if incomplete, restores psychological comfort. This dynamic does not require deception. It arises naturally in environments where certainty is scarce. Across generations, this process compounds. Each reinterpretation moves further from original context. Memory does not simply fade, it transforms. Practical knowledge becomes symbolic. Technical processes become stories. History becomes narrative. By the time environmental stability begins to return, humanity is no longer equipped to recover what was lost. The cognitive and cultural infrastructure required to recognize, preserve, and transmit deep knowledge has eroded. Even when conditions allow for complexity, the pathway back is unclear. This is why later civilizations often appear to emerge suddenly, without visible antecedents. The antecedents existed, but they were not recorded, not preserved, not understood. What looks like invention may in fact be rediscovery, incomplete and uneven. The death of culture therefore leaves behind a paradoxical legacy. Humanity survives with remarkable resilience, yet becomes estranged from its own past. The species retains intelligence, creativity, and adaptability, but loses continuity. It remembers surviving, but not how survival reshaped it. This estrangement shapes how history is later constructed. When records finally reappear, they begin from a truncated baseline. The deep past is rendered silent. Not because nothing happened, but because the mechanisms of memory were broken. In this silence, later societies project their own assumptions. They imagine beginnings where there were interruptions. They see simplicity where there was once complexity. They mistake absence of record for absence of experience. Understanding this process requires abandoning the idea that history is lost through catastrophe alone. It is lost through adaptation, through narrowing, through the quiet, rational decisions made by individuals and groups trying to endure uncertainty. Culture does not die screaming. It dies whispering, one generation at a time. And when humanity eventually begins to rebuild at scale, it does so atop this quiet grave. Foundations remain, but blueprints are gone. The result is a world that feels ancient yet unfamiliar, rich in remnants yet poor in explanation. This is why the deep past feels distant, even when its traces are close. It is not separated from us by time alone, but by a long period of forgetting that reshaped what humanity was able to remember. Fear does not begin as a story. It begins as sensation. Long before it is named, explained, or remembered, fear enters the body. It accelerates the heart, narrows vision, sharpens attention. In moments of catastrophe, fear is not a response. It is an environment. For early humanity emerging from prolonged disruption, fear did not arrive briefly and depart. It settled in, shaping perception long after the immediate danger had passed. Trauma differs from ordinary memory in one critical way. Ordinary memory records events. Trauma records threat. It imprints not details but associations. Sounds, movements, environments become charged. Water is no longer just water. Darkness is no longer just absence of light. The body remembers even when the mind does not. As rising waters, collapsing ecosystems, and unpredictable seasons reshaped the world, fear became chronic. Not panic, but vigilance, the constant readiness for danger. This state rewired behavior. Humans learn to scan their surroundings continuously, to anticipate loss, to expect sudden change. Over time, this expectation embedded itself so deeply that it no longer required conscious thought. Fear became instinct. Psychologically, this transformation marks a shift from situational threat response to generalized anxiety. When danger is unpredictable and prolonged, the nervous system adapts by assuming threat everywhere. This adaptation improves survival in hostile environments, but it also reshapes cognition. Attention prioritizes negative signals. Memory favors warning over reward. Curiosity recedes further. Importantly, fear in this context is not irrational. It is learned accuracy. Those who assumed safety were more likely to die. Those who anticipated danger endured. Over generations, these patterns were reinforced culturally. Behaviors that minimized exposure were praised. Risk-taking was discouraged. Caution became virtue. As fear stabilized, it began to outlive its original cause. Even as certain dangers diminished, the psychological imprint remained. The body does not update as quickly as the environment. Trauma lingers because it is encoded below conscious awareness. It is carried forward not as narrative, but as reflex. This is how the era of fear begins, not as a defined period, but as a state of being. One of the most powerful vectors of this fear was water. Rising seas did more than erase land. They erased certainty. Coastlines shifted within living memory. Familiar territories vanished. What had once been stable boundaries became unstable fronts. The sea, once a source of sustenance and movement, became an unpredictable force of loss. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Humans evolved to navigate landscapes that changed slowly. Rapid inundation violates this expectation. It creates a sense of betrayal similar to that experienced with the sky, but more intimate. Water invades. It surrounds. It leaves no refuge. Fear of water is therefore not merely practical. It is symbolic. It encodes helplessness. It teaches that ground itself can disappear. This lesson imprints deeply because it undermines the most basic assumption of safety, that the land beneath one's feet will remain. Darkness operates similarly. In unstable environments, night amplifies uncertainty. Vision narrows, sounds distort, threats feel omnipresent. When danger becomes associated with darkness repeatedly, fear attaches itself not to specific predators, but to the condition of not seeing. Over time, darkness itself becomes threatening. These associations accumulate. Flood, darkness, cold, noise, silence. Each becomes linked to danger through repeated pairing. The brain does not distinguish between cause and context. It encodes patterns of threat broadly. This is efficient for survival, but costly for memory, because when fear dominates perception, the past is filtered differently. Events are remembered not for their sequence or meaning, but for their emotional charge. Trauma compresses time. Long periods collapse into singular impressions. The narrative thread breaks. As a result, collective memory becomes distorted. What survives are intense images rather than coherent accounts. The memory of catastrophe persists, but stripped of detail. Later generations inherit fear without explanation. They know what to avoid, but not why. They carry caution without context. This is how fear becomes cultural. It is transmitted not through explicit teaching, but through behavior. Children observe what adults avoid. They learn where silence falls, where voices lower, where movement slows. Fear is communicated through tone, posture, and reaction long before it is explained. Over time, these patterns solidify into norms. Norms become values. Values become identity. A culture shaped by fear prioritizes stability above all else. Change becomes suspect. Innovation feels dangerous. Even when conditions allow for expansion, hesitation remains. The memory of loss lingers as a warning encoded in habit. This does not mean such cultures are weak. On the contrary, they are resilient. They endure. But endurance achieved through fear has consequences. It limits trust. It constrains imagination. It narrows the range of acceptable futures. As fear embeds itself at the instinctual level, it reshapes how humanity relates to uncertainty. Unknowns are no longer opportunities. They are threats. The unknown past becomes something to avoid rather than explore. Digging too deeply into what was lost risks reopening wounds. Forgetting, in this context, becomes protective. Not forgetting of danger, but forgetting of origin. The cause of fear fades while the fear itself remains. This asymmetry defines the era of fear. Humanity remembers to be cautious, but forgets what taught caution in the first place. As generations pass, this fear becomes abstracted into story, symbol, and taboo. Certain places are avoided. Certain behaviors are forbidden. Certain narratives are repeated without explanation. Fear persists because it works. It keeps people alive. But it also keeps the past at a distance. This is the psychological environment that shapes humanity after the Great Regression. A world where survival has been secured, but confidence has not returned. A world where memory is selective, filtered through trauma, and oriented toward warning rather than understanding. The era of fear does not end when danger ends. It ends only when trust is rebuilt. And trust, once broken at the scale of land, sky, and sea, takes generations to restore. Until then, fear remains the silent architect of human behavior, shaping not only how people live, but what they allow themselves to remember. When fear becomes instinct, it does not remain confined to moments of danger. It begins to organize behavior. Over time, what started as a response hardens into a framework. Fear becomes a rule-making force, shaping how societies define safety, morality, and acceptable risk. For early humanity, this transformation marked a decisive shift. Survival was no longer just a condition of life, it became the organizing principle of culture itself. In environments shaped by prolonged instability, rules emerge not from philosophy but from avoidance. Communities learn what not to do before they learn what to do. Do not go there. Do not stay too long. Do not trust what lies beyond sight. These prohibitions are rarely explained in detail. Explanation invites questioning. Questioning invites risk. Instead, rules are enforced through repetition and consequence. Psychologically, this reflects a transition from exploratory learning to defensive learning. The brain, conditioned by trauma, prioritizes error avoidance over opportunity seeking. It becomes more sensitive to potential loss than potential gain. This asymmetry is not accidental. In unstable environments, a single mistake can be fatal, while missed opportunities rarely are. As fear-driven rules accumulate, they begin to shape moral frameworks. Actions that increase exposure are labeled reckless. Behaviors that reduce uncertainty are praised as wise. Courage is redefined not as exploration but as endurance. Virtue becomes synonymous with restraint. This moralization of fear has deep consequences. When caution is elevated to principle, change becomes ethically suspect. Innovation must justify itself not by promise, but by safety. The burden of proof shifts heavily against the new. As a result, societies become conservative in the most literal sense, oriented toward conserving what already works. This conservatism stabilizes fragile systems, but it also freezes them. Once fear defines the boundaries of acceptable behavior, those boundaries become difficult to cross, even when conditions improve. The psychological cost of violating deeply ingrained rules remains high. Guilt, anxiety, and social sanction persist long after the original dangers fade. Over generations, these fear-based rules lose their connection to lived experience. What began as practical avoidance becomes tradition. Practices are followed because they have always been followed. The original reasons are forgotten, but the emotional weight remains. This is how fear becomes invisible. It no longer feels like fear, it feels like normality. This invisibility is reinforced through socialization. Children learn boundaries before they learn explanations. They internalize caution through observation, not instruction. A pause before approaching water. Silence in certain places. Hesitation at the edge of the unknown. These behaviors are absorbed unconsciously and carried forward without question. Fear, in this way, becomes culture. Once embedded, fear shapes how societies process information. Evidence that contradicts inherited caution is treated with suspicion. An environment that appears safe is assumed to be temporarily deceptive. Stability is interpreted as fragile. The past teaches that calm can precede catastrophe. This lesson, learned deeply, makes trust difficult to rebuild. As a result, societies shaped by fear develop a particular relationship with uncertainty. They do not seek to eliminate it through understanding. They seek to contain it through limitation. The unknown is not something to be explored, but something to be bounded. This approach has a direct impact on memory. Exploration of the past involves uncertainty. It requires confronting loss, ambiguity, and the possibility that former assumptions were wrong. In fear-shaped cultures, such exploration feels threatening. Digging into the past risks destabilizing the present equilibrium. Forgetting, therefore, becomes adaptive. Not forgetting that danger exists, but forgetting how pervasive danger once was. The specifics of trauma fade while the behavioral responses persist. This selective forgetting allows fear to function without overwhelming consciousness. The mind carries caution without reliving terror. But this adaptation has a cost. When the origin of fear is forgotten, fear becomes unchallengeable. It is no longer possible to evaluate whether caution is still warranted. Rules persist without context. Boundaries harden without reason. This is why fear-driven societies often struggle to reinterpret the past accurately. Historical remnants are approached with anxiety rather than curiosity. Unexplained structures, tools, or traditions provoke unease. Without contextual memory, these remnants are either ignored or mythologized. Myth becomes a safe container for fear. It allows societies to acknowledge danger without analyzing it. Stories encode warnings in symbolic form. Floods become divine punishment. Darkness becomes moral threat. Monsters inhabit the unknown. These narratives preserve caution while avoiding confrontation with raw trauma. This process does not require deception or manipulation. It is an emergent property of fear-conditioned cognition. When understanding feels dangerous, symbolism provides distance. It transforms overwhelming reality into manageable narrative. As myths stabilize, they further reinforce behavioral boundaries. They teach what to avoid, whom to fear, where not to go. Over time, myth and fear merge into a single system of regulation. Culture becomes a mechanism for maintaining safety through restriction. This system is effective. It reduces exposure. It limits risk. It increases survival under uncertainty. But it also narrows possibility. It constrains imagination. It discourages the reconstruction of complex histories that might challenge inherited assumptions. Even when material conditions eventually improve, this legacy persists. Fear-conditioned rules do not dissolve automatically. They must be consciously re-examined. But re-examination itself carries psychological risk. It threatens the sense of safety built around restriction. As a result, societies often choose stability over truth. They preserve the emotional logic of fear even when its factual basis has eroded. The past remains partially inaccessible, not because evidence is absent, but because engagement feels unsafe. This is how the era of fear extends across centuries. It is not sustained by continuous catastrophe, but by memory patterns shaped during catastrophe. Humanity carries forward a psychological architecture designed for survival in instability, long after instability subsides. This architecture influences how later civilizations interpret the deep past. They inherit caution without context. They approach ancient remnants with reverence or suspicion, rarely with neutrality. They sense danger encoded in silence, even when they cannot name it. The era of fear, then, does not end with recovery. It becomes a shadow cast forward, a silent influence shaping what humanity allows itself to know. And in that shadow, vast portions of the past remain untouched, not destroyed, but avoided. The greatest loss in human history did not occur in fire or conquest. It occurred quietly, beneath rising water. As sea levels rose and coastlines retreated, vast regions of human activity vanished from the landscape. These were not marginal territories. They were among the most fertile, connected, and productive environments early humanity had known. Coastlines were where resources converged, where movement was easiest, where exchange was possible. They were, in effect, the centers of the ancient world. When these regions disappeared, humanity did not merely lose land, it lost concentration. Knowledge, like culture, thrives in density. It accumulates where people gather, where ideas circulate, where specialization is possible. Coastal zones offered precisely these conditions. Abundant food supported larger populations. Trade routes encouraged interaction. Innovation emerged not from isolation, but from contact. These regions functioned as repositories of collective experience, places where memory was reinforced through repetition and exchange. As the waters rose, these repositories were erased. The psychological impact of this loss was profound but uneven. Those who lived in these regions experienced displacement. They fled inland, carrying fragments of knowledge but not the systems that sustained it. Those who already lived at higher elevations survived in place, but without access to the cultural density that had once supported complexity. In both cases, continuity broke. This is a crucial distinction. Survival did not favor the most knowledgeable. It favored the most geographically fortunate. Those who remained were not necessarily the custodians of culture. They were the ones farthest from the flood. As a result, history became unbalanced. The centers vanished. The peripheries remained. From a sociological perspective, this inversion matters. Peripheral communities tend to be less specialized, less interconnected, and less reliant on large-scale coordination. Their knowledge is often practical, localized, and resilient, but not cumulative. When these communities become the primary carriers of memory, the nature of memory itself changes. What survives is not the full archive, but a subset optimized for endurance. This process resembles the loss of a library, not through deliberate destruction, but through neglect. When the buildings vanish, the books scatter. Some are carried away, many are lost. None remain intact. The catalog is gone. The organizational logic disappears. What remains are isolated volumes without context. Human knowledge suffered a similar fate. Skills that required institutional support faded. Practices dependent on coordinated labor disappeared. Techniques passed down through dense networks fractured into local variants. Over generations, these variants drifted further from their origins. Without reference points, reconstruction became impossible. Psychologically, this fragmentation altered how people perceived the past. Without visible centers of memory, history lost coherence. It became difficult to imagine a time when knowledge was centralized, when societies operated at scale. The absence of evidence was interpreted as absence of existence. What could not be seen could not be conceived. This cognitive bias reinforced forgetting. Humans tend to infer the past from the present. When the present is fragmented, the past is imagined as fragmented as well. The idea that earlier humanity might have been more interconnected, more coordinated, or more complex than later survivors felt counterintuitive. This is how the drowning of knowledge became invisible. The archaeological silence of submerged landscapes compounds this invisibility. What lies beneath the sea is difficult to access, expensive to explore, and often ignored. As a result, the material record itself reinforces the illusion that coastal regions were marginal rather than central. Absence of data is mistaken for data of absence. Over time, this misinterpretation hardens into narrative. History is reconstructed around what survived rather than what was lost. Inland sites become default reference points. Mountain and plateau cultures define the baseline. The vanished lowlands fade from imagination. This selective visibility shapes collective memory. Humanity remembers its margins and forgets its centers. The burning of the library, then, is not metaphorical destruction. It is geographic erasure. Knowledge does not need to be suppressed to disappear. It only needs to lose its habitat. When environments that support memory vanish, memory follows. This loss also alters power dynamics in emerging societies. Survivors who lack access to deep knowledge nevertheless become authorities by default. They tell the stories that remain. Their experiences define what is remembered. Over time, their perspective becomes history. This is not deceit, it is inevitability. History is written by those who survive, but survival does not correlate with understanding. Those who endure may carry fragments, but fragments cannot reconstruct systems. Without context, even accurate memories lose explanatory power. As generations pass, the awareness that something vast has been lost fades. The silence becomes normal. Questions about missing knowledge no longer arise because there is no reference for what is missing. The past feels complete within its reduced frame. This is how the drowning of knowledge reshapes civilization. Not through trauma alone, but through absence. The library burns not in spectacle, but in silence. By the time humanity begins to rebuild, it does so atop a truncated foundation. Later civilizations inherit ruins without manuals, techniques without theory, stories without chronology. They attempt to interpret these remnants using their own frameworks. Meaning is assigned retroactively. Gaps are filled with assumption. This process creates the illusion of mystery. Ancient achievements appear inexplicable not because they were supernatural, but because the connective tissue that explained them is gone. The deeper past becomes opaque, not because it was hidden, but because it was submerged. Understanding this dynamic requires abandoning the idea that knowledge is lost only through violence or collapse. It is lost through displacement, fragmentation, and the quiet reorganization of survival. The burning of the library did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded as coastlines receded, as people scattered, as centers dissolved. And by the time the waters stabilized, the library was already gone. What remained was humanity, alive, adaptive, resilient, but carrying only a fraction of what it once knew. When centers of knowledge vanish, history does not disappear. It relocates. The loss of coastal hubs and densely populated regions did not erase humanity's past outright. It transferred narrative authority to those who remained. Survivors became historians, not because they understood more, but because they endured longer. And endurance, over time, becomes legitimacy. This shift has lasting consequences. Knowledge preserved by survivors reflects the conditions of survival, not the conditions of origin. What is remembered is filtered through the experiences of those who lived at the margins of former complexity. Their stories emphasize resilience, adaptation, and scarcity, because these were the realities they knew. The vanished centers, the places where coordination, specialization, and accumulation once thrived, are absent from their lived memory. As a result, history narrows. This narrowing is not intentional. It is structural. Human beings construct narratives from available material. When the material is incomplete, the narrative adapts accordingly. Over generations, this adaptation solidifies into assumption. The past is imagined to resemble the present because no alternative reference survives. This is why early historical reconstructions tend to underestimate the scale of earlier organization. Large, interconnected systems feel implausible when all evidence points to fragmentation. The absence of visible centers reinforces the belief that none existed. What cannot be imagined is not remembered. Psychologically, this reflects a cognitive bias toward continuity of scale. Humans assume that complexity increases over time. When confronted with a past that appears simpler, they infer gradual progress rather than regression. The possibility that earlier societies were more coordinated than later survivors conflicts with intuitive narratives of advancement. This bias is strengthened by material evidence. Inland settlements, mountain refuges, and small communities leave clearer archaeological traces than submerged coastal zones. These traces become the foundation of historical understanding. What lies beneath the sea remains silent, reinforcing the illusion that it never mattered. As generations pass, the stories told by survivors lose their provisional nature. They become origin stories. Adaptation is reinterpreted as beginning. What was once a response to loss becomes framed as initial development. Regression is mistaken for primacy. This reinterpretation reshapes identity. Societies define themselves not as inheritors of a diminished legacy, but as founders of a new one. This framing provides psychological stability. It removes the burden of loss. It transforms survival into achievement. But this stability comes at the cost of accuracy. Fragments of the older world persist, but without context, they resist integration. Unexplained structures, anomalous tools, and mismatched techniques appear sporadically in the archaeological record. Without connective narratives, these anomalies are treated as isolated curiosities rather than evidence of broader systems. This is where mystery begins to replace history. Later cultures encounter remnants of a deeper past and struggle to situate them within inherited frameworks. The temptation to attribute them to myth, legend, or external forces grows not from superstition, but from narrative necessity. When continuity is broken, explanation becomes difficult. The mind seeks coherence, even at the expense of precision. Importantly, this process does not imply deception. Survivors do not erase the past deliberately. They simply lack the means to preserve it fully. Memory without reinforcement decays. Stories without relevance fade. Over time, even the awareness that something larger once existed disappears. This disappearance is gradual. Each generation inherits a slightly smaller archive than the one before. What is lost first are technical details. What follows is structural understanding. What remains last are symbols, images stripped of their original function, preserved because they feel important rather than because they are understood. As symbols accumulate, they shape cultural imagination. The past becomes a landscape of enigmas. Monuments stand without builders. Techniques appear without lineage. Knowledge feels discontinuous. This discontinuity invites speculation, but speculation fills gaps only partially. From a sociological perspective, this environment favors simplified historical models. Linear progress narratives become attractive because they reduce complexity. They provide a clear beginning, a clear trajectory, and a clear present. They avoid the discomfort of acknowledging loss at the heart of civilization. This avoidance reinforces forgetting. When societies rebuild, they do so using available fragments. They rediscover techniques independently. They reinvent tools. They construct new systems that resemble the old only superficially. Without access to the original frameworks, reconstruction is incomplete. What emerges is continuity in function, not in form. This is why later civilizations often attribute earlier achievements to mythic ancestors or divine intervention. These attributions are not claims of ignorance. They are acknowledgments of explanatory failure. When technical lineage is missing, agency is reassigned symbolically. The burning of the library thus leaves a distinctive imprint on human consciousness. It produces a past that feels both familiar and unreachable. Humanity senses depth without clarity. It recognizes that something has been lost, but cannot specify what. This vague awareness shapes attitudes toward the past. Curiosity is tempered by uncertainty. Exploration is cautious. The deeper one looks, the more gaps appear. Without a coherent narrative, investigation risks destabilizing identity. As a result, societies often settle for partial explanations. They accept ambiguity. They preserve symbols rather than systems. They build histories that begin after the rupture, rather than confronting the rupture itself. This choice is not weakness, it is adaptation. It allows cultures to move forward without being paralyzed by absence. But it also ensures that the deep past remains obscured. The survivor's history becomes humanity's history. What is remembered reflects who endured, not who understood. What is recorded reflects what remained accessible, not what once existed. The library is not rebuilt. It is replaced with a smaller archive assembled from scattered pages. And because those pages are incomplete, the story they tell is incomplete as well. Understanding this dynamic reframes how we interpret silence in the historical record. Silence does not imply emptiness. It implies loss. It signals that knowledge once existed in forms and places that did not survive. The burning of the library is therefore not merely an event. It is a condition, a structural absence that shapes how humanity remembers itself. And in that absence, the deep past waits, not hidden, not forbidden, but fragmented beyond easy recovery. When memory fractures and fear persists, the human mind seeks refuge in meaning. Not factual meaning, but psychological meaning. After prolonged disruption, after regression, after the loss of cultural continuity, the past becomes too fragmented to be remembered as it was. Events lose sequence, causes blur, consequences linger without explanation. In this environment, myth is not a distortion of reality. It is a translation of it. Myth emerges when literal truth becomes emotionally unsustainable. Trauma resists precise narration. Experiences marked by overwhelming fear are difficult to recall in detail. The mind protects itself by compressing them, reducing complexity into symbols that can be carried without reliving the full weight of terror. This process is not unique to ancient societies. It is a universal psychological response. Individuals who endure trauma often remember it in fragments, images, sensations, emotions, rather than coherent stories. Cultures behave in much the same way. For humanity emerging from environmental catastrophe and cultural rupture, the past was not simply unknown. It was painful. Remembering too clearly risked reopening wounds that threatened fragile stability. Forgetting entirely was impossible, because the behavioral lessons encoded by fear remained necessary. Myth offered a solution. It preserved warning without preserving detail. In this transformation, concrete events became archetypes. Floods became moral deluges. Fire from the sky became divine judgment. Darkness became chaos. These narratives did not aim to record history. They aimed to regulate behavior. They encoded danger into stories that could be shared without explanation. From a psychological perspective, this is a form of coping. Myths allow societies to externalize trauma. They relocate fear from lived memory into narrative space. The threat is no longer an unresolved event. It becomes a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Even if the ending is catastrophic, it provides closure. Closure, even tragic, is preferable to ambiguity. Importantly, myth does not require belief in literal truth to function. Its power lies in emotional resonance. A story about an angry sky teaches caution regardless of whether the listener believes the sky has intention. A tale of a great flood teaches respect for water, even if the details vary. Myth simplifies complexity into actionable meaning. This simplification becomes necessary when knowledge systems have collapsed. Without access to empirical explanation, societies rely on narrative coherence. Myth restores causality where factual continuity has been lost. It answers the unanswerable, not by accuracy, but by adequacy. This is where modern misunderstandings often arise. Myth is frequently dismissed as primitive explanation. In reality, it is sophisticated psychological technology. It allows large groups to coordinate behavior, transmit caution, and maintain identity under conditions where literal history cannot be preserved. As myths stabilize, they begin to organize collective memory. What is remembered is no longer what happened, but what must be avoided. Memory shifts from descriptive to prescriptive. The past becomes a moral landscape rather than a chronological one. This shift has consequences. Once myth becomes the primary carrier of memory, factual reconstruction becomes difficult. Details that do not serve the narrative are discarded. Contradictions are resolved symbolically rather than analytically. Over generations, stories adapt to new contexts, absorbing local fears and values. This adaptability is a strength, but it also accelerates forgetting. Each retelling moves further from original events. The myth remains relevant, but its historical core erodes. Eventually, the story no longer points back to a specific catastrophe. It becomes timeless, unanchored from any particular moment. This is how humanity loses track of when things happened, even while remembering that they happened. Myth also reshapes authority. Those who control narrative interpretation gain influence. Elders, priests, storytellers, figures who can frame fear into meaning become central. Their role is not to preserve accuracy, but to preserve coherence. In unstable societies, coherence matters more than truth. This does not mean myth is deceptive. It means it serves a different function. Where history seeks to explain, myth seeks to contain. It limits the psychological spread of trauma. It prevents paralysis by offering structure. But containment has a cost. Once fear is safely enclosed within myth, there is little incentive to reopen it. Inquiry becomes threatening. Questioning myth risks destabilizing the emotional balance it provides. As a result, myths are protected. They become sacred. Their symbolic truth is defended even as their historical content fades. Over time, this protection creates a barrier between humanity and its own past. The deeper layers of memory are sealed behind narrative walls. What remains accessible is metaphor, not mechanism. This is why attempts to reconstruct deep history often encounter resistance, not from ignorance, but from inherited caution. Digging into the literal past threatens to strip myth of its protective function. It risks reintroducing uncertainty where certainty, however symbolic, has been established. From a sociological standpoint, this resistance is understandable. Societies built atop fragile recovery cannot afford constant destabilization. Myth provides continuity when history cannot. It binds communities together through shared symbols, shared fears, and shared lessons. However, this binding also fixes memory in place. It slows reinterpretation. It discourages revision. As centuries pass, myths ossify into tradition. They are taught as timeless truths rather than adaptive responses to specific conditions. At this point, humanity no longer remembers that myth was once a translation. It experiences myth as origin. The symbolic replaces the historical entirely. This is the birth of myth, not as story, but as structure. A framework that governs how the past is perceived, how danger is understood, and how identity is constructed. It allows humanity to move forward without being crushed by what lies behind. But it also ensures that the deep past remains inaccessible. The more effective myth becomes at containing trauma, the less incentive there is to confront its source. Silence settles where inquiry once might have emerged. The birth of myth is therefore not a failure of reason. It is a triumph of survival psychology. It allows a wounded species to endure, to stabilize, and to rebuild. But it does so by transforming memory into symbol. And once memory becomes symbol, returning to literal history requires dismantling the very structures that made survival possible. This is the tension that defines humanity's relationship with its earliest past. The truth exists, but it is buried beneath layers of narrative designed not to reveal, but to protect. Understanding this tension is essential. Without it, myth appears as deception. With it, myth reveals itself as a necessary bridge between catastrophe and continuity. The question is not why humanity created myths. The question is how much history those myths were designed to replace. As myth takes root, it does more than translate trauma. It reorganizes memory itself. What began as a coping mechanism gradually becomes the primary framework through which the past is understood. Over time, stories no longer point back to specific events. They stand in for them. Memory, once anchored in experience, is replaced by narrative repetition. This transition is subtle. It does not feel like forgetting. It feels like remembering differently. In societies shaped by rupture, myth offers a stable structure where history cannot. It provides continuity across generations when factual transmission has failed. Children grow up learning stories that explain the world not as it was, but as it must be understood to remain safe. These stories carry emotional truth even as their historical content dissolves. Psychologically, this substitution serves an important function. Literal memory of catastrophe carries unresolved fear. Narrative memory contains fear within familiar patterns. The mind prefers a story it can revisit to an experience it cannot process. Over time, the story becomes the memory. This process alters how truth is defined. Truth shifts from correspondence with past events to alignment with shared meaning. A myth is considered true not because it happened exactly as told, but because it reinforces identity, values, and caution. Accuracy becomes secondary to coherence. Once this shift occurs, the incentive to preserve detail disappears. Specifics that do not serve the story are trimmed away. Contradictions are resolved symbolically. Complexity is smoothed. What remains is a narrative that feels complete even though it is historically incomplete. This smoothing accelerates forgetting. Each retelling reinforces the symbolic structure while eroding factual anchors. Over generations, even the awareness that the story once corresponded to real events fades. Myth becomes origin rather than interpretation. From a sociological perspective, this transformation stabilizes societies recovering from disruption. Shared myths synchronize behavior. They define boundaries, justify norms, and transmit caution efficiently. They reduce uncertainty by providing a common lens through which experience is filtered. But this efficiency has consequences. When myth becomes the primary carrier of memory, inquiry into the past becomes constrained. Questions that challenge the narrative threaten social cohesion. They risk reopening uncertainty that myth was designed to close. As a result, curiosity about deep history is discouraged, not through force, but through discomfort. This discomfort manifests as reverence. Myths become sacred. Their authority is emotional rather than evidentiary. Challenging them feels like an attack on identity. Over time, this sacredness insulates myths from revision. They are preserved intact even as their relevance shifts. This insulation further distances humanity from its deeper past. The symbolic layer thickens. Beneath it, historical memory grows faint. What remains accessible is the lesson, not the event, the warning, not the cause. Importantly, this does not mean that societies lose all awareness of history. They retain a sense that something significant occurred. Catastrophe remains present as atmosphere rather than narrative. It shapes attitudes, fears, and expectations without being clearly articulated. This atmospheric memory influences how later civilizations interpret remnants of the past. When they encounter ancient structures, unexplained technologies, or anomalous artifacts, they do not approach them neutrally. They project mythic frameworks onto them. The unknown is absorbed into existing stories rather than prompting new investigation. This projection is not error, it is continuity. It allows societies to integrate anomalies without destabilizing their worldview, but it also prevents reconstruction. Myth explains enough to satisfy emotional needs, leaving little incentive to pursue deeper understanding. Over centuries, this dynamic produces a layered past. At the surface are recorded histories, linear, partial, beginning after the rupture. Beneath them lie myths, timeless, symbolic, detached from chronology. And beneath those myths lies a fragmented historical reality that is difficult to access because the tools to interpret it have eroded. This stratification shapes modern perceptions of ancient history. The earliest periods appear simultaneously simple and mysterious. They seem devoid of record yet rich in symbolism. This paradox arises because what survived was not documentation, but narrative adaptation. The birth of myth thus marks a turning point. Humanity no longer relates to its deepest past through memory, but through metaphor. The past becomes something to be interpreted rather than recalled. Meaning replaces mechanism. This shift has long-term implications. When societies eventually regain stability and surplus, the myths remain. They continue to influence thought, art, and belief long after their original function has faded. Attempts to reinterpret them historically often meet resistance, not because evidence is lacking, but because myth has become embedded in identity. Recovering deep history in such a context requires more than data. It requires psychological willingness to disturb inherited narratives. It requires separating emotional truth from historical truth, without dismissing either. This is a delicate process, one that many societies avoid. As a result, myth persists as both bridge and barrier. It connects humanity to its traumatic origins while obscuring the specifics of those origins. It preserves continuity by sacrificing detail. This is why the deep past feels simultaneously present and unreachable. Its influence is felt everywhere, in fears, taboos, symbols, but its events remain elusive. Humanity carries the echo of catastrophe without the memory of its shape. Understanding this dynamic reframes myth not as deception, but as survival technology. It allowed a fragmented species to carry forward lessons that could not be preserved literally. It made recovery possible by containing pain within story. But it also ensured that when humanity looked back, it would see a past filtered through layers of narrative defense. The original events would be distant, distorted, and difficult to reconstruct. The birth of myth, then, is not the end of history. It is the moment history becomes indirect, a moment when humanity chooses coherence over clarity, meaning over mechanism. And in making that choice, it secures survival, while accepting that much of its earliest story will remain beyond easy reach. Forgetting is often treated as failure, a weakness of memory, a loss of intelligence. But for humanity, forgetting has frequently been a strategy, not a conscious decision, but an adaptive response. After catastrophe, after regression, after the collapse of continuity, remembering everything is not only impossible, it is dangerous. The human mind does not preserve memory indiscriminately. It filters. It prioritizes what sustains life and discards what threatens it. In stable environments, this filtering favors accumulation. In unstable ones, it favors release. Memory that no longer serves survival becomes weight, and weight slows adaptation. This is the beginning of collective amnesia. Not a sudden erasure, but a gradual disengagement. The past is not denied, it is set aside. Attention shifts away from what cannot be acted upon toward what must be endured. Over time, memories that evoke helplessness are accessed less frequently. Neural pathways weaken. Emotional charge fades. What remains is a simplified narrative that allows forward movement. Psychologically, this process mirrors individual trauma response. Survivors often do not forget traumatic events entirely. They remember selectively. Details blur. Sequences distort. The emotional intensity is contained. This selective forgetting is not dysfunction, it is regulation. It allows daily functioning to continue without constant intrusion from overwhelming memory. At the scale of a species, a similar mechanism emerges. Humanity, confronted with losses too vast to integrate, lost lands, lost cultures, lost knowledge, gradually reduces the salience of those memories. What cannot be rebuilt is deprioritized. What cannot be explained is symbolized. What cannot be endured consciously is absorbed unconsciously. This adaptation reshapes identity. A society that remembers too much of its own destruction risks paralysis. It becomes trapped in mourning. By contrast, a society that forgets selectively can rebuild, even if the reconstruction rests on incomplete understanding. This does not mean forgetting is total. Core lessons persist. Fear remains. Caution survives. Behavioral patterns encoded during catastrophe continue to guide action. What is forgotten are specifics, timelines, mechanisms, origins. Humanity remembers that the world can end, but forgets exactly how it almost did. This asymmetry is crucial. It allows vigilance without obsession. It preserves survival instincts while releasing narrative burden. Over generations, this balance stabilizes. The species learns to live with the echo of catastrophe rather than its full memory. From a sociological perspective, this selective amnesia becomes institutionalized. Educational systems, rituals, and traditions emphasize resilience and continuity over rupture. Histories begin after recovery, not before collapse. The story of survival replaces the story of loss. This narrative framing serves a purpose. It restores agency. It presents humanity as capable rather than fragile. It shifts focus from vulnerability to endurance. In doing so, it reinforces cohesion. But cohesion achieved through forgetting has limits. As generations pass, the distance from original events increases. Amnesia deepens. What was once selective becomes structural. Entire periods fall outside the scope of collective awareness. The deep past becomes abstract, then mythic, then silent. Importantly, this silence is not enforced. It emerges naturally from relevance. Memory systems evolve to support present needs. When ancient events no longer inform immediate survival or identity, they are allowed to fade. The mind, both individual and collective, is economical. This economy of memory explains why humanity can lose vast chapters of its own history without noticing. The absence does not feel like loss because there is no reference point. One cannot mourn what one does not know existed. Yet traces remain. Anxiety about collapse, fascination with origins, unease around unexplained remnants. These are not coincidences. They are symptoms of incomplete forgetting. The past is not gone. It is submerged beneath layers of adaptation. This submerged memory influences behavior indirectly. It shapes how societies respond to uncertainty. It informs fears that lack clear cause. It fuels myths, taboos, and narratives of destruction and rebirth. In this sense, humanity does not suffer from total amnesia. It suffers from partial amnesia. The emotional residue persists while the factual content dissolves. The lesson remains without the story. This condition is stable, but not complete. It allows humanity to function, but it also constrains understanding. When later civilizations encounter evidence that challenges simplified histories, confusion arises. The mind resists integration because it lacks a framework to accommodate deeper continuity. As a result, evidence of ancient complexity is often minimized or reinterpreted, not because it is threatening in itself, but because it destabilizes a narrative built on forgetting. To acknowledge a forgotten age requires acknowledging loss, regression, and vulnerability, concepts that selective amnesia was designed to soften. This resistance is not denial, it is inertia. Collective memory, once reorganized around survival, does not easily reopen old wounds. Inquiry into deep history becomes emotionally charged. It risks reactivating fear without offering immediate benefit. For many societies, the cost seems too high. Thus, humanity continues forward with an incomplete self-understanding. It builds civilizations, develops technology, and records history, all atop a truncated foundation. The past before the rupture remains obscure, not because it is inaccessible, but because it has been strategically deprioritized. This is what it means to be a species with amnesia, not ignorant of the past, but selectively disengaged from it, not unable to remember, but unwilling to carry the full weight of memory. The amnesia is not random. It is patterned. It reflects the psychological demands of survival in a world that once proved itself capable of profound instability. Understanding this reframes the question of lost history. The question is not why evidence is missing. The question is why forgetting was necessary. And the answer lies not in conspiracy or suppression, but in adaptation. Humanity forgot because remembering everything would have made survival impossible. What remains now is the challenge of recovery. To look back without reopening trauma, to reconstruct without destabilizing identity, to remember selectively again, but this time with awareness. This challenge defines the present relationship between humanity and its deepest past, a relationship shaped not by ignorance, but by long practice in forgetting. Selective amnesia does not erase the past. It reshapes how the past is allowed to exist. What humanity forgets consciously does not vanish. It relocates. It moves from narrative into mood, from explanation into instinct. The forgotten does not disappear. It becomes background. This background influences behavior in ways that feel natural rather than historical. Caution feels like wisdom. Anxiety feels like intuition. A sense of fragility surrounds human progress even in moments of confidence. These feelings are rarely traced back to origin. They do not need to be. Their function is not to inform, but to regulate. This is the paradox of collective amnesia. It removes the burden of memory while preserving the emotional architecture shaped by memory. Humanity continues to act as if it remembers, even when it no longer knows what it remembers. From a psychological standpoint, this is highly efficient. The mind is spared the constant replay of trauma while retaining the lessons encoded by it. But efficiency comes at the cost of understanding. Without narrative access to the past, behavior becomes detached from explanation. Humanity knows how to respond, but not why those responses exist. This detachment shapes modern identity. Civilizations define themselves as forward-moving, innovative, progressive. The idea that humanity may have experienced profound regression contradicts this self-image. Progress narratives depend on linearity. They assume accumulation rather than interruption. Amnesia supports this assumption by removing evidence of collapse from awareness. When evidence of interruption does appear, gaps in the archaeological record, unexplained discontinuities, anomalous structures, it is often framed as anomaly rather than pattern. Anomalies can be ignored. Patterns demand explanation. Selective amnesia favors the former. This preference is not driven by fear of truth, but by cognitive economy. Integrating loss into identity requires revising foundational assumptions. It requires acknowledging that civilization is not guaranteed, that knowledge can vanish, that progress is reversible. These acknowledgments carry psychological weight. For a species that survived by forgetting, reopening that weight feels unnecessary, even risky. As a result, humanity lives with a partial map of itself. The known past begins after the rupture. The deeper past remains abstract. Curiosity exists, but it is constrained by frameworks built during forgetting. Questions are asked, but only those that can be answered without destabilizing the present. This constraint influences how societies invest in historical inquiry. Research into origins is often compartmentalized. It is treated as specialized rather than foundational. The deep past is seen as optional knowledge rather than essential context. This reflects not indifference, but inherited prioritization. What was once necessary to forget remains difficult to remember. Importantly, this does not mean recovery is impossible. It means recovery must proceed differently. Humanity cannot simply restore lost memory. The original carriers are gone. The original contexts are gone. Reconstruction must rely on fragments, inference, and patience. This process is slow and uncomfortable. It challenges simplified narratives. It introduces uncertainty where certainty has been culturally valued. It forces confrontation with vulnerability. These are not easy demands for a species whose identity has been shaped by endurance rather than reflection. Yet the impulse to recover persists. It appears in the fascination with ancient civilizations, in the unease provoked by unexplained ruins, in the recurring sense that something important has been missed. These impulses are not random. They are symptoms of incomplete amnesia. The mind senses absence even when it cannot name it. This sensing creates tension. On one hand, humanity benefits from forgetting. On the other, it seeks coherence. The desire to understand origins competes with the desire to remain stable. This tension defines modern engagement with deep history. Some approaches resolve the tension by minimizing the past. Others resolve it by mythologizing it. Both avoid direct confrontation. Both preserve emotional equilibrium. A different approach requires reframing forgetting itself. Instead of treating amnesia as failure, it can be understood as a phase, a necessary narrowing that allowed survival, but not an endpoint. Memory, once suppressed, can be cautiously reopened. This reopening does not require abandoning myth or dismantling identity. It requires contextualizing them. Myths can be seen as adaptations rather than explanations. Fear can be understood as legacy rather than prophecy. The past can be approached as incomplete rather than forbidden. Such an approach allows inquiry without destabilization. It acknowledges loss without being consumed by it. It accepts that humanity may never recover a full account of its deepest past, but it also rejects the assumption that silence implies simplicity. Living with amnesia does not mean remaining bound by it. The challenge lies in balance. To remember enough to understand, but not so much as to reopen trauma. To reconstruct cautiously, recognizing that gaps will remain. To integrate vulnerability into identity without collapsing into fear. This balance is difficult, but it is not unprecedented. Humanity has adapted before. It adapted to catastrophe by forgetting. It can adapt again by remembering selectively and consciously. In doing so, the species may begin to see itself more clearly, not as a linear success story, but as a resilient system shaped by cycles of expansion, collapse, and recovery. Such a perspective does not weaken humanity. It grounds it. Understanding amnesia as strategy rather than flaw allows a more honest relationship with history. It explains why the deep past feels distant even when evidence lies close. It clarifies why reconstruction is resisted even when curiosity persists. Humanity lives today not in ignorance of its past, but in the aftermath of forgetting it. The structures built during that forgetting still shape thought, culture, and identity. Recognizing this does not restore lost memory, but it changes how absence is interpreted. Silence becomes signal rather than void. Gaps become meaningful rather than dismissible. This recognition prepares the ground for the final question. Not what humanity forgot, but what remains of that forgetting today. The shadow of amnesia still falls across modern thought. It shapes fears of collapse, obsessions with apocalypse, and anxiety about continuity. These are not new concerns. They are echoes. To understand those echoes, humanity must finally turn toward the shadow it has long carried forward, without panic, without myth, and without denial. That shadow is not the past itself. It is the memory of having once lost it. The past does not disappear when it is forgotten. It changes form. What is no longer remembered as history survives as pattern, as instinct, as expectation. Humanity may have released the details of its deepest rupture, but it did not escape its consequences. The shadow of that rupture stretches forward, shaping how modern societies perceive risk, continuity, and the future itself. This shadow is most visible in anxiety. Modern humanity lives in an era of unprecedented technological power, yet it remains haunted by the possibility of collapse. The fear of sudden endings persists even when material conditions appear stable. Civilizations invest extraordinary effort into predicting disaster, preventing catastrophe, and imagining the end of the world. These concerns are often treated as products of modern complexity, but their emotional intensity suggests deeper origins. Psychologically, this anxiety resembles inherited vigilance rather than rational assessment. It is disproportionate to immediate threat. It surfaces repeatedly across cultures, ideologies, and historical periods. It is not tied to a single danger, but to the idea that stability itself is fragile. This sensitivity reflects a memory that no longer has a story. Humanity learned long ago that continuity could fail. That lesson was encoded not as narrative, but as caution. The result is a persistent expectation that order is temporary, that systems can unravel faster than understanding can adapt. Even when evidence suggests stability, the underlying assumption remains: this may not last. This assumption shapes modern decision-making. Societies stockpile resources, they build redundancies, they obsess over resilience. Progress is celebrated, but rarely trusted. Innovation is pursued alongside fear of unintended consequence. Advancement carries an undertone of risk. This is not irrational pessimism. It is legacy. The shadow of the past also shapes how humanity relates to nature. Despite scientific understanding, the environment is often framed as something that can turn hostile without warning. Climate anxiety is not merely a response to data. It is amplified by inherited sensitivity to environmental betrayal. The idea that the world itself can change rapidly and catastrophically resonates at a level deeper than analysis. This resonance explains why environmental threats provoke existential fear rather than localized concern. They echo an older wound, a time when the land, the sky, and the sea ceased to behave as expected. Modern language describes this in scientific terms, but the emotional response draws from a much older reservoir. The same pattern appears in cultural narratives. Stories of apocalypse, collapse, and rebirth recur across media and ideology. These stories are not predictions, they are expressions. They externalize a persistent sense that civilization rests on unstable ground. They give form to an anxiety that lacks specific memory. From a sociological perspective, these narratives serve a regulatory function. They allow societies to rehearse collapse symbolically. They provide emotional preparation for loss without requiring lived experience. In this way, modern apocalypse narratives function much like ancient myths. They contain fear while preserving vigilance. But they also reinforce the shadow. By repeatedly framing the future as precarious, societies normalize the expectation of disruption. Even when catastrophe does not arrive, the anticipation shapes behavior. Trust in long-term continuity remains limited. Planning rarely extends beyond assumed instability. The future is approached with caution rather than confidence. This cautious orientation influences how humanity builds institutions. Systems are designed with failure in mind. Laws anticipate breakdown. Economies assume volatility. Political structures emphasize control and contingency. These designs reflect rational foresight, but they are also informed by inherited mistrust of permanence. The shadow of forgetting thus becomes self-reinforcing. Expecting instability encourages structures that prioritize control over openness. These structures, in turn, constrain imagination. They limit the range of futures considered viable. Stability becomes something to manage rather than inhabit. At the individual level, this manifests as unease around success and abundance. Prosperity feels temporary. Comfort feels conditional. There is a persistent sense that one should not become too attached, too invested, too confident. This emotional posture mirrors the mindset of ancestors who learned that attachment to stability could be dangerous. Even joy carries an undertone of vigilance. Importantly, this shadow does not paralyze humanity. It sharpens it. The same anxiety that limits trust also drives preparation. The same fear that constrains imagination also fuels innovation aimed at preventing collapse. Humanity's capacity to anticipate risk is extraordinary. But anticipation without memory lacks context. It becomes generalized, diffuse, difficult to satisfy. This diffuse anxiety explains why modern societies struggle to define what safety actually means. Threats are constantly reassessed, but reassurance rarely endures. Each resolved danger is replaced by another. The underlying unease remains unchanged, because it is not about specific threats. It is about the memory of unpredictability itself. The shadow also shapes how humanity interprets its own past. Historical narratives emphasize progress, but they are haunted by gaps. When confronted with evidence of ancient complexity, modern frameworks struggle to integrate it. The idea that humanity may have lost something fundamental contradicts assumptions of linear advancement. This contradiction produces tension. Either the evidence is minimized or the narrative must change. Minimization is easier. It preserves identity. It avoids confronting vulnerability. The shadow encourages this avoidance by reminding humanity at an emotional level that loss is destabilizing. Thus, the shadow perpetuates forgetting even as curiosity grows. Yet curiosity persists precisely because the shadow exists. The sense of missing knowledge, the fascination with origins, the pull of ancient enigmas, these are expressions of incomplete amnesia. Humanity senses that its self-understanding is partial. It feels the weight of absence without knowing its shape. This tension defines the modern condition. A species capable of extraordinary analysis, yet haunted by unease it cannot fully explain. A civilization that records history meticulously, yet suspects that its deepest chapters are missing. The shadow is not the enemy of understanding. It is the consequence of survival. It is the imprint left by adaptation on consciousness. To eliminate it would require erasing the lessons that allowed humanity to endure. The task, then, is not to banish the shadow, but to recognize it. Recognition changes relationship. When the shadow is acknowledged as legacy rather than prophecy, anxiety becomes interpretable. Fear becomes contextual. Vigilance becomes choice rather than compulsion. This recognition does not restore what was forgotten. It does something quieter. It allows humanity to stand beside its past rather than flee from it. And that posture, neither denial nor obsession, marks the threshold of maturity, a point where a species can begin to examine its own history without being overwhelmed by it. The shadow we still cast is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of endurance. It shows where humanity has been shaped by loss and where it remains sensitive to continuity. Understanding that shadow does not end the story. It prepares the ground for its final question. To remember is not the same as to relive. This distinction matters because for much of human history, memory was dangerous. Remembering too much, too clearly, risked reopening wounds that survival required to close. Forgetting was not ignorance, it was containment. But containment is not permanence. It is a phase. The question humanity faces now is not whether it should remember, but how. Modern societies possess tools that earlier generations did not. Archaeology, climatology, genetics, and historical analysis allow glimpses into deep time without requiring lived exposure to catastrophe. We can approach the past indirectly, analytically, with distance. This distance changes the psychological equation. It makes remembering possible without re-traumatization. Yet the hesitation remains. The inherited fear that once protected humanity still influences what questions feel acceptable. There is caution around narratives of collapse, regression, and loss. These narratives challenge the comforting assumption that progress is inevitable. They introduce vulnerability into identity. They suggest that what exists now is not guaranteed. But acknowledging vulnerability does not weaken a civilization. Denying it does. The mature relationship with the past is neither romanticization nor avoidance. It is integration. Integration allows loss to be recognized without being centered. It accepts that humanity has endured ruptures without defining itself solely by them. This is where the concept of a forgotten age must be handled carefully. It is not a claim of hidden greatness or lost perfection. It is an acknowledgement of discontinuity, a recognition that human history is not a smooth ascent, but a series of adaptations shaped by environment, trauma, and recovery. Remembering in this sense does not require filling every gap. Gaps will remain. Evidence will be partial. Silence will persist. The goal is not total reconstruction. It is contextual understanding. Understanding that forgetting was functional changes how absence is interpreted. Missing chapters no longer imply insignificance. They imply survival under conditions where preservation was impossible. This reframing shifts the conversation from speculation to humility. Humility is essential. Without it, inquiry turns into projection. With it, inquiry becomes patient. A humble approach accepts that some knowledge cannot be recovered in full. It also accepts that partial recovery is still meaningful. Patterns can be identified without overstatement. Discontinuities can be mapped without fantasy. Human behavior can be understood through psychology and sociology rather than myth or conspiracy. This approach restores agency to humanity. It removes the need for external explanations. It recognizes that humans were capable, adaptive, and resilient, capable of building complexity, capable of losing it, and capable of rebuilding differently. Seen this way, the deep past is not a mystery demanding revelation. It is a landscape requiring careful navigation. Modern anxiety about collapse takes on new meaning in this context. It is not prophecy. It is memory residue, a caution inherited from ancestors who learned painfully that stability could vanish. This caution can inform preparation without dominating imagination. Preparation grounded in understanding is different from preparation driven by fear. Understanding allows societies to design resilience without paranoia. It allows long-term planning without denial of risk. It allows continuity to be valued without being assumed. The shadow, once recognized, no longer dictates behavior unconsciously. It becomes part of awareness. This awareness also reframes modern fascination with ancient history. The draw toward origins, lost cultures, and missing chapters is not escapism. It is an attempt at integration. Humanity senses that its self-story is incomplete. It seeks coherence, not superiority. When approached responsibly, this curiosity can strengthen rather than destabilize identity. It can expand the narrative of humanity from a linear ascent into a resilient cycle. Such a narrative accommodates loss without glorifying it. The danger lies not in remembering, but in remembering carelessly. When gaps are filled with certainty rather than caution, myth returns in modern form. When absence is treated as proof rather than invitation, inquiry collapses into belief. The work of remembering without breaking requires restraint. It requires accepting uncertainty. It requires resisting the urge for dramatic conclusions. It requires recognizing that silence in the record is itself information, not about what did or did not happen, but about what could or could not be preserved. This restraint aligns with the audience humanity has become. A species capable of reflection, aware of its psychological limits, and increasingly conscious of its own narratives. In this sense, the present moment is unique. Humanity is distant enough from its deepest rupture to examine it without being consumed by it, yet close enough to feel its echoes. This balance offers opportunity, an opportunity to reinterpret myths as signals rather than statements, to view fear as inheritance rather than instruction, to see forgetting as adaptation rather than failure, and to understand that history is not only what is written, but what is survived. The forgotten age of humanity, then, is not a lost golden era waiting to be uncovered. It is a period shaped by trauma, adaptation, and silence. Its outlines are faint because they were never meant to be preserved. Survival demanded forgetting. What remains now is choice. Humanity can continue to treat its deepest past as unknowable, or it can approach it carefully, acknowledging limits while seeking patterns. It can reject simplistic narratives without abandoning curiosity. It can hold uncertainty without filling it with fear. This choice does not lead to final answers. It leads to better questions. Questions that respect evidence. Questions that respect psychology. Questions that respect the cost of memory. The story of humanity does not begin where records start, and it does not end with recovery. It is an ongoing process of remembering and forgetting, shaped by the environments we inhabit and the meanings we require to endure them. To look back honestly is not to diminish humanity. It is to see it clearly, as a species that survived instability not by preserving everything, but by letting go of what it could not carry. The shadow we still cast is not something to escape. It is something to understand, because within that shadow lies the quiet truth of human history. Not that we were once perfect, or advanced, or enlightened, but that we endured, adapted, and continued, even when continuity itself was broken. And that endurance, more than any monument or myth, is the real legacy of our forgotten past.